Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Gen Z's Tragic Anxiety and Nietzsche's Goat Theory. King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus. When Silenus at last fell into his hands, the king asked what was the best and most desirable of all things for man. Fixed and immovable, the demi-god said not a word, till at last, urged by the king, he gave a shrill laugh and broke out into these words. O wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery, why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach. Not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy. Satyr. Noun. Greek mythology, one of a class of lustful, drunken, woodland gods. In Greek art, they were represented as a man with horse's ears and tail, but in Roman representations, as a man with a goat's ears, tail, legs, and horns. Well, hi everybody, and can I apologise from the get-go that it's in the UK at the time of filming this. It's July 2025, and there's this very strange yellow thing high in the sky on this normally dank, dark, miserable island. And I think we're experiencing what you could call a heat wave by our very low, admittedly, standards. And I don't do heat. I think I've mentioned before, as a friend once said to me, I am whiter than Dracula's bum. So my paleness and my heft means that I struggle in this weather. So if I keel over or explode, you'll know what happened. But this is the thumbnail, and it's a Picasso painting of a goat's head on a table. And it brings together some of the key themes of this talk, which goat in both the sense, because I'm so with it, and modern language, I do appreciate, because people sometimes question my use of titles, goat as in the greatest of all time, because I think Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy is one of the greatest of all time books, and that is a key theme that we're pursuing in this talk. But also the concept of goats as well, in the more literal sense, as representatives of the Dionysian. This concept of, it's also referred to as the Bacchanalian, because Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and frenzy, intoxication, and Dionysus is the Greek version. But this idea of the birth of tragedy is all about the combination in Greek tragedy of the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the reason and brightness and light with darkness and chaos and intoxication and frenzy. And Nietzsche argued that Greek tragedy uniquely combined these two things in tension and kept them together brilliantly in an aesthetic and artistic form. And I'm suggesting in the title that the tragedy of Gen Z, which by all accounts, I've used in previous video a graph from Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Age of Anxiety. It's generally recognised that Gen Z are not a happy bunch in lots of mental health measurements. And it may sound completely bonkers, but I honestly think the tragedy is that Gen Z doesn't have enough exposure to things like Greek tragedy. They don't have exposure to the cathartic elements that art can possess and allows you to help process the thing that is life. And one of the themes of today is that our mortality is this paradoxical thing, that we're all moving towards our end, but that's what gives it meaning. And at various points I'll describe artistic representations of immortality and how actually, as the Chinese would say, be careful getting what you wish for. for anyone who doesn't want to be mortal and wants everlasting life, according to various artistic representations, it's the worst thing you could hope for. So the very thing that we all fear, the end of our days, is the very thing that actually makes us human, makes us worthwhile. And art, arguably, is uniquely placed to make sense of that nonsensical paradox, that the end of our lives is actually a gift that gives our lives meaning. So, actually, if you scratch the surface, it may not seem it at first, but this is ultimately quite a life-affirming talk, despite the dead goat's head on there. And I wanted to see this. I remember I watched, for the life of me, I can't remember what it was, but it was a weird one of these Nordic noir TV dramas from years ago. And the Icelandic detective stops off at a motorway service station and has boiled sheep's head. Ugh. And tucks into it with gusto. And apparently that's what you can get in an Icelandic garage, service station, restaurant. So if there's any Icelandic viewers, please disabuse me that this is still possible today. But this, like I said, is a Picasso, 1953, I think. I think it was called something like Goat's Head on a Table. It does what it says on the tin. But I think it's quite stunning. And like I say, it encapsulates for me this affirmation of mortality in a way that the various thinkers I'm going to talk about today, I think, would approve. So this is the overarching argument that I'm going to outline. So I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek here, but if I've said let's take Gen Z anxiety as a given, because I don't see much disagreement that this is a uniquely miserable generation, Gen Z. But the dialectical reasoning in Hegel that was then borrowed by Marx, the concept of dialectical reasoning is that there's a thesis, an idea, there's an antithesis, the opposite of that idea, and the two things combine, and what you get is a synthesis, the third element. So if I was going to present my arguments in that dialectical form, this would be it. The thesis: we can't know the essence of reality except via imperfect representations that provide, if not ultimate answers, then at least psychological catharsis. Art best provides those cathartic representations. So that's, I would strongly argue that I think it's the major theme of this channel. And this idea of not knowing the essence of reality, that's something that will come up. Various philosophers are suggesting that we only have, by definition, an imperfect understanding. We can't grasp the inner essence because we're separated from it by our very humanity. The antithesis to that is that art is elitist nonsense, and we should spend all our time in a 24/7 frenzy of screen swiping and pathological FOMO, fear of missing out. So again, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I'd argue that is the dominant bovine social value belief system that we're living in. You can't go to a public event, not that I ever do anymore, but you can't go anywhere, or even I can't even watch football on television without seeing people in the crowd filming the very thing they've gone to see in person. I'm gonna go off on one if I'm not careful. So anyway, that's the antithesis. And what I'm suggesting is the world we find ourselves in today is the synthesis. The most materially privileged generation in human history suffers from constant anxiety and unhappiness, and sometimes feels the need to identify as bizarre personas or animals. Deep down, it knows there is something more to life, so it projects its inadequacies into cancelling history, dyeing its hair blue, and shouting angrily at people in order to promote tolerance. So again, my slightly jaundiced perception of what the synthesis amounts to. But that's my take on the modern contemporary situation we find ourselves in. And all the way through this talk, I'm going to ask, to what extent are all of the problems we're facing? A major element of that, I'd argue, is that we're lacking the role of art. And I think that's true of the following. If you analyse the following philosophical perspective I'm going to outline, I think this is quite a strong argument, but I'll see whether I can convince you. So a range of philosophers that I'm not going to be able to cover all these ideas today, but in future videos, this is what I hope to develop. You've got Socrates here. Then you've got Immanuel Kant, and I'll explain the relevance of all these in a second. Then you've got Schopenhauer, who, talking about goats, looks like he's got a goat hairstyle. And then you've got, that's a moustache and a half, Friedrich Nietzsche himself. So, starting off with Socrates and Plato, because we obviously get Socrates' teaching via Plato, based on reason and logic, and Plato, I think, is a more complicated case. I think he represents Socrates' incredibly logical mode of thinking in a slightly arch way, because despite his heavy emphasis upon reason, Plato, in his work, often resorts to allegories, myth, and he sets up arguments in such a way, there's a dramatic element to the dialogues that you can't but think. And the whole of the Republic, this idea, this ridiculous Republic in some ways that he sets up as a thought experiment, that people have taken him at his word, literally. I think there is more of a metaphorical element to Plato, but that's a story for another day. But in terms of Socrates and Plato normally being associated with reason and logic, and then you have Immanuel Kant had this idea of transcendental idealism, and I won't bore you with the details, but one of the key things to think about that came from Immanuel Kant is he argued, as human beings and the way our brains work, we cannot access the thing in itself, Ding an sich. The thing in itself is inaccessible because we think in terms of abstract reasoning. We abstractly process our sense perceptions. Now, in that sense, Kant was looking at the limitations of the reasoned life that Socrates and Plato were proposing. And then the second two, you've got Schopenhauer, this idea of the world as will and representation was his magnum opus, that he wrote quite early on in his career, and then spent a large part of his life being bitter. He never got the recognition he deserved. This is a bit autobiographical. And then decided, then he got the recognition late on in life, but he never really did much more than this major work. And his concept is he was influenced more than most Western philosophers by Eastern philosophy, the Upanishads and other things. And the idea was the world as will. I'll be talking about it as we go along, but this idea is the life force behind the essence of our life that we see manifested everywhere, but you can't really experience it directly for all the reasons Kant pointed out, but we do represent it. And in future, I want to explore Schopenhauer's idea of aesthetics and how art is a unique part of human experience because it allows us to represent the life force and observe it and appreciate it rather than just giving into it and being overcome by it. And there are some similarities, and Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer, but there's also differences. But I think it truly is the goat, the birth of tragedy, where Nietzsche distinguishes between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian is this reason and logic that Socrates and Plato promoted, versus the Dionysian, which is more to do with the life force. But it's the darkness, it's what was presented in Greek tragedy, but in unique ways that I'm going to explore. So the Dionysian, the Bacchanalian, it's a dark, frenzied, orgiastic underside to civilized reason, and Nietzsche's point was the Greeks uniquely managed to balance the two, and that to the extent that we've lost that balance, I'm suggesting Gen Z's anxiety is at least partly to do with the fact they're imbalanced. They don't have this mix of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. They can, on occasion, bleat like goats with a virtuous frenzy of virtue signalling. They can also be in this realm, the cyberspatial realm of social media, where there's this Apollonian light everywhere, these images, these portrayals of reality flying around the ether. But the balance between the two is not provided to them, or they can't access it in the type of aesthetic philosophical form that even the ancient Greeks could. So in that sense, you could argue Gen Z has gone backwards. But that all of this, I'm just trying to give you an overview of where some of this philosophy will take us, but please don't get too hung up on this. I'm going to explain now. Concentrate on Nietzsche at the bottom. Nietzsche, as he interpreted this perennial, all I'm showing these different types of philosophers for is to give you an idea of how it's a perennial problem. How do you deal with the balance between pure reason and the life force that you're trying to apply that reason to? So Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, arguably is, I'd suggest, the goat, in the sense that he addresses it head on. He's the goat of goats. He treats the goat-like Dionysian bacchanalian impulse in a brilliantly discursive way. But just to provide some light relief, because I do appreciate that's quite heavy, but here's some free life coaching, which takes me back as my memories of whenever I was at a dinner party and the conversation started flagging. This was my party piece. But this is a Attic red figure wine cooler, basically. And I think it's called a komos. It's a highly acrobatic revel. And I think the estimate is this is about 500 BC. So these are the satyrs, the goat-like creatures, and because Bacchus or Dionysus was the god of wine, wine is always, nearly always involved. And these are some other images. So the one is the ivory inset of a couch, I think it was. About 200 to 100 BC. And the other is a mixing vase. But again, you can see the depictions of the satyrs. And then if you'll indulge me, this is just a personal anecdote because it will explain one of the reasons I became very interested in the concept of the Dionysian, believe it or not. But this was a football called Sean Gota. And before Manchester City, the football club, got taken over by an oil state, they played on a ground called Main Road, which was not the most salubrious of grounds. And about just before it closed down, actually, and they shifted to a much more modern, state-of-the-art stadium, I was in this very basic Main Road, and this guy was playing, and the constant chant from the crowd was, I was with a Chelsea supporter watching, he got me the ticket, City versus Chelsea, and I'm a Liverpool fan with a Liverpool accent, so I couldn't open my mouth. My friend kept saying things to me with this broad London accent, so I was telling him to shut up, and all around us were these mad Man City fans screaming, "Feed the goat." So there was this bacchanalian, this was the footballing embodiment of bacchanalian excess, the Dionysian, this constant refrain, "Feed the goat." And I don't think he scored that day, but there would have been a Dionysian frenzy if he had. But on the concept of Bacchus or Dionysus, these are two videos. I've created a playlist where these are two previous videos that look at some of these themes. So if you want to go back in the catalogue, you can see some previous material I've produced. But for today, this is what I'm concentrating on. I think it's a brilliant book. I have no links to the guy, don't know him. I might send him an email to say that I was doing this video, which I hope will please him, but you never know. But the drunken Silenus, he takes, I'll show you this is a detail on the cover from the painting he refers to in detail. And he did another book called The Fate of the Animals, I think, which is based on a 1913 German expressionist painting by Franz Marc, which I might look at if this video goes down well. I could quite easily look at that as well. But I think it's a brilliant book. He goes off on tangents, so I wonder why I like him. But he always brings it back to this concept of Silenus. And at the very beginning, you saw the conversation or the question that King Midas asked. And in the previous two videos, I've looked at Jeff Bezos and his Bacchanalian crowd in Venice. And it strikes me that Bezos, in some senses, is a modern-day Midas. All the money in the world, and they're looking for him and his crowd immortality. So constant Botoxing of natural wrinkles. The way Meis analyzes Silenus in his book is that Silenus is constantly inebriated, partly because he's trapped in this immortal constant party. He himself is just a demigod, but because he's the tutor and guardian of Dionysus, who's a full god, Silenus has to be around all the time. And Mises' point is that he's trapped in this netherworld, neither a human nor a true full god. And this immediately raises the concept of mortality and immortality. And that's one of the major themes of this talk, is that immortality may seem brilliant, but actually art allows you to engage with the practicalities of why you wouldn't want to be immortal, and what mortality gives us and what it allows to appreciate. And again, it just strikes me that all the aesthetic qualities art provides us with, Gen Z largely lacks, because the world's moved on. The type of knowledge that Morgan Meis is writing about in this book, it's like the title of this channel, it's a lost art. And I think this is at least contributing to many of the social problems we've got with the Gen Z. But Meis says the question of good and bad for man is cancelled before it can be asked. It's preempted. The satyr would never think to answer that question. When King Midas asked the question of Silenus, the first response is silence. It's not a question a goat would ask. Goats don't ask questions like, what is the best thing for goats? Goats just go out and express goatliness. Or if you're Sean Goater, you express your goatiness by scoring goals. But this is the painting. So it's the Drunken Silenus by Peter Paul Rubens, and it's 1617, 1618. And there are various things. So later on, I'll talk about how Meis emphasizes the way Silenus is falling almost diagonally out of the bottom of the picture, and to some extent he's stopped by the breastfeeding nymph at the bottom. She almost like blocks him out. But then you've also got the woman looking at us in the top corner. And that's interesting because Meis argues that is a way in which we're drawn into the painting, where our involvement is co-opted by this woman looking at us. And then you've got the goats in the bottom as well. You've got the goat man, the satyr, holding the arm. And then you've got the black guy giving his Silenus's thigh a good pinch to urge him almost out of the painting, Meis argues. There's a lot going on in that painting. But why I think it's quite poignant, according to Meis and others, is that Silenus is, like I said before, trapped. I'm trying to think of concepts of living forever. Let's to bring it down a notch of cultural reference. But didn't Alphaville want to live forever? There's Freddie Mercury wanted to live forever. And I think Oasis is one of their lyrics, isn't it? Living forever. But Silenus is never happy with it because he's constantly drunk, trying. He's in this constant haze, trapped in this netherworld. And that, to that extent, he's a very poignant character. Where I think the implication of Midas asking him what's best, I think the implication is Midas, he wants immense wealth, but like Jeff Bezos, he also seems to want longevity or immortality. And this whole talk is about the limitations, the way in which that is just not a good idea, despite it seeming commonsensical. You know, who wants to reach their end of days? Yet without that process, human life has no meaning. That is the ultimate essential paradox. So Silenus sniffs out the real intent of the question. He knows the pain of living. He hears the bleat of the goat every day in the forest and knows something of the unnameable desires that give vent to it. The bleat comes up from a dark place. Silenus knows that. He knows that Midas wants to live on and on. So he tells King Midas the truth. And all the way through, I'll intersperse, as usual, what I'm saying with some images. So this is the drunken Silenus brought before King Midas, and it's from the circle of Sebastiano Ricci from the 19th century. And I think from there's various myths, but because Midas returns Silenus to Dionysus, I think that's when Midas is given the power to turn everything into gold. And obviously that, like the desire to be immortal, doesn't work out because it can't, because everything turns to gold. What would you do in that situation? You can't touch anyone, you can't eat. So I think after he's been rewarded, inverted commas, with that gift, he then goes and joins Silenus and adopts a much simpler life. So constantly with Midas and Silenus is this interaction that's all about knowledge and what is the secret to life. And in Mises' terms, death is actually a gift, but you can't see the gift as the gift that it actually is. You've been given a gift and you want more than anything to throw the thing away. This is the paradox I was talking about, that our mortality is what gives our life value, but the mortality of our lives is what we're constantly fighting against, especially if you're Mrs. Bezos. Don't throw it away. Run to it if you can. Be the life toward death that you are. So I'm guessing this explains why some daft people throw themselves out of planes, admittedly with parachutes, and extreme sports people. It's this dicing with death also gives you joie de vivre. It's this constant tension between the two things, says the man who spends an inordinate amount of his time on a couch. Silenus takes the real question hidden inside the fake question of King Midas and brings it to the surface, lays it bare. And then this is Bacchus and Ariadne by Titian, 1520 to 23. And I won't bore you with, I've looked at the Minotaur in the past. So Ariadne is abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos, where this is depicted. The guy flying through the air with the very fetching pink cape is Dionysus. So she's been abandoned by Theseus, who's killed the Minotaur. And this is the entourage of Dionysus come to collect her and take her away. But there's various interesting themes here, or images. So in that corner you can see on the donkey, that's a very small depiction of Silenus. And then I also like this little boy, or satyr boy, carrying, as you do, a cow's head on a piece of string. What every little boy wishes for. So these paintings are full of these types of details. And I always think it's sad that if you don't have any knowledge of mythology, most of these paintings are automatically just going to pass you by, when just the minimum amount of knowledge brings them alive. But anyway, you can see examples there of both the small boy and the satyr waving around what probably looks like, I'm no vet, but an ox thigh bone or something similar. So Nietzsche saw something awful and essential. He saw a root sense of life that bubbled and boiled to no specific purpose, the sheer drive of existence, the sheer expression of a life drive and a death drive. Even that doesn't explain it very well. It's hard to give words to the thing that Nietzsche saw. The mad, empty discharge of life spoke to him out of that ancient Greek tragic sense, the one that produces tragedies, the one that celebrated Dionysian rites in secret caves, the one that pulled animals apart with its bare hands, the one that had the voice of a goat, the bleat of a goat. So I think in Greek it's sparagmos, is this tearing apart. And in a future day I'll go into more gory detail if there's any appetite for it. But for anyone who's curious, there's a short section of Thomas Mann's book, The Magic Mountain. I think it's just called Snow, where the protagonist Hans Castorp gets caught in a snowstorm. He shelters, and because it gets so cold, he drifts off into this fevered dream while sheltering. And it shows this idyllic ancient Mediterranean scene. And then I won't go into details, but he goes into this temple and sees a horrible sight that relates to Dionysian rites. And it's all, the book itself, The Magic Mountain, it's about a tuberculosis sanatorium in the Alps. And I think it's in the interwar years of the 20th century, and it's metaphorical for the decline of a European civilization. But it also shows you the dark roots in this scene of what lies behind Greek culture, the darkness, the Dionysian. But this idea of the voice of the goat, the bleat of a goat, I just thought Meis doesn't talk about these images, the next ones I'm going to show you. But I just thought it would be interesting to put them in conjunction with Meis's words. So this is the Hoyer's dark imagination. And this is the Great He-Goat, one of the black paintings that Hoyer did. And there's a detail of it. Silenus, Nietzsche thought, shows us life as sheer expression of itself and nothing more, nothing less. Life screams out and then is extinguished. This screaming out can be grand or pathetic, but to embrace it as such is to exist beyond good and evil, obviously riffing on Nietzsche's book of the same name. Beyond good and evil, thought Nietzsche, is beyond the categories we create for ourselves in our own fear. We fear the pure expression of life and its drive and pure need to be. Life is seething up from its source and bursting forth and then dying away. And in what follows, just to emphasize, Meis does not look at these paintings. And I hope it's not me just making incredibly subjective associations. But I've always been interested in the artwork of Henri Rousseau, and I've never really fully understood why. And then reading more this Meis book and also more Nietzsche recently, this concept of, and Schopenhauer, this concept of the life force and how it can lie, not hiding, but in the depths of art. It's what art is referencing but never fully expressing. I'd be interested if you think of this quotation about the life force, life screams out and then is extinguished, if you can keep this in mind, and then hopefully I'll convince you that this type of idea also helps you understand an artist like Rousseau, or maybe it's just me, but we'll see. So I understand Silenus and Nietzsche were talking, or Nietzsche's talking with reference to Silenus about forests. And Meis picks up on this idea about the darkness of the forest, and in Western fairy tales, the idea that Little Red Riding Hood goes into the deep dark forest. And there's all these sexual connotations, and Freud and Bettelheim and all these people, psychoanalysts, getting very excited about the symbolism of the deep, dark forest. But it's something that's always struck me about seemingly naive, primitive, childish paintings of Rousseau. This isn't, I'm going to show you better examples, but this is just an hors d'oeuvre. because you can get the density of the jungle, if not the forest. But I'm using the jungle and forest synonymously. But just the way the animals look back at you, seemingly, innocently, but increasingly, the more I look at them, the more disturbing I find them. Now, this is more full on the darkness. And I think it's disguised by the fact there's so much colour. But then you look off to the side and the tree trunks, the darkness between them. And then you've got, I'm assuming, you've got all the fruit in the trees. And I'm assuming the thing in the back is not a huge big piece of fruit, but rather the setting sun. And again, sorry to repeat myself, but just the way the animals look at you. And even the monkeys at the bottom, their faces are hidden by the globes of the fruit. So just the eyes are poking over the top. Like a weird simian game of peekaboo. A scream in the wilderness, a scream, a tussle, a death, again and again. It is beyond good and evil, thought Nietzsche, beyond anything we can say about it. And Nietzsche looked to Silenus as the carrier of that truth, the truth of life beyond good and evil, the cry that goes up from the deepest glade in the forest, one beast falling upon another. The silence that echoes in the depths of the forest, nothingness, and then strength out of that nothingness. And what I love about this is that if you just looked at it without due care, it's almost as if the horse is eating the jaguar. It's got like a nonplussed, blasé look on its face, insofar as it has a face. A rather long face. But it's just so lacking in emotion that contrasts with the gravity of what's happening to it. I can't quite, and I suppose this is the whole point of visual art. It expresses in a visual form what can't be adequately expressed with words. But there's something Rousseau does with his images that is just misleadingly simple and naive, when actually I think these paintings are much darker, both in terms of lighting but also in terms of theme, than I think they first appear. And this is entitled "The Hungry Lion Throws Itself on the Antelope" from 1905. And again, on the branch, the panther or whatever it is looking back at us. And the owl by the blood-red sun. I just think, to me, this speaks of the life force that Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Meis are talking about. And you're probably getting the sense now of he had quite a consistent theme when he did jungle paintings, did our Henri. And this is le rêve, the dream in French. And obviously you'd expect to find a chaise longue in your average jungle. lion seemed quite agitated. And you've got someone playing a recorder-like instrument. And just to add to the ensemble, an elephant behind the chaise longue. Very odd. Yeah, I see a monkey hanging from one of the branches as well, just above the woman playing the instrument. I'm guessing is that orange thing a snake? So these are the jungle scenes, and there's the darkness of the life essence, and then this is probably just me, I'm sure. But this has always intrigued me because of the oppressiveness of the sky, the ominous dark shape of the church, which I'm assuming it's a church because it looks like a spire. But the way in which the telephone poles, electricity poles, whatever they are, the whole aura of this painting to me is oppressive. And I think it's called View of Malakoff Urtusen, 1903. So it's the oppressiveness and it's the impending role that technology is going to play in 1903, so 11 years later, the start of the First World War and all the horrors that brought, which the First World War was the first real adoption of modern technology as we know it in a war. Tanks replaced horses. I think they fought alongside each other. I'm sure I've seen footage that the tanks and the artillery were, beginning to become incredibly powerful. But anyway, that just the oppressiveness of the aura. And again, I'm sorry to belabor the point, but it's just the darkness and the way in which there's a certain essence of the life force that Rousseau somehow, at least to me, manages to express. And this one intrigues me because in all the others, we're looking into the jungle. And in this case, the forest is where we seem to be looking out of the forest into so-called civilization, or this representation, these houses. So it's a reversal of the usual view. And then finally, if I had to nominate a top 3 for depictions of the gloomy oppressiveness of an autumn sunset, this would be in my top 3. And in terms of the theme of mortality that we're looking at, or I'm imposing on you, the dying of the day. The Dionysian is a feeling of ecstatic oneness with the surrounding universe. That is why it is drunken and orgiastic. It's a losing of oneself. With Dionysus, you merge with the one pure life force. This is ecstasy. So that's the upside of the Dionysian. And in terms of Greek theatre, so I think this is where this was at the time was Segesta, which is modern day Calatafimi in Sicily. But it's basically Greek theatre. Or it's theatre based upon the Greek model. And it just struck me that that would give you a sense, this idea of Greek tragedy combining the Dionysian and the Apollonian, this sense of oneness with the life force. If you were sat in that theatre with those light conditions and brilliant tragedies of Sophocles, whatever, you can imagine the effect would be quite amazing. It's also a source of profound depression when you come back. You realise after an orgiastic ecstasy that your particular individuality does not matter. You would rather be erased in the complete cosmic overabundance. That's what happened to Silenus. He had a taste of this drunken dissolution in the one. It made him stop caring. So this is the netherworld Silenus is trapped in. Like orgiastic excess only has value or meaning if it's an occasional thing. It's a departure from the norm. But he's trapped in it all the time. So this is scarily similar to me trundling into the shower every day. There's an image to conjure with. But Silenus on the top of the donkey, in all of these, well, in nearly all of these pictures, he's almost completely insensible through alcohol. Rubens wanted to paint Silenus as if he could reach past that inviolable boundary that separates painting from the real world. Rubens wanted the space to connect, the worlds to connect, the ideas to connect. Rubens does one thing with that painting that always makes me feel vertigo when I think of it. He tilts the whole framing. It's dizzying, really, the effect. It makes you a little drunk and disoriented just to look at it. The whole painting is tilted on its axis and spilling down from the top of the canvas into the bottom. The satyr is pinching him. Perhaps that will give him the extra momentum he needs to penetrate the boundary of the painting. The pinch gooses him up for one powerful final lurch. The downward slope of the painting spills everything to the bottom right corner. With the pinch and the release, the satyr is giving Silenus the final impetus that he needs to erase the impermeability of the line between the painting and the reality of the world in which the painting resides as a painting. Silenus represents two things for Nietzsche. He's the hard truth of the horror of existence, and he is the mad and gleeful acceptance of that horror in the sheer discharge of life. Nietzsche imagines that Silenus would respond to King Midas first with the silence of contempt, and then with the laughter of contempt. The old king, Silenus thinks in Nietzsche's version, is able neither to grasp the fact that existence is horror, nor that there is a possible celebration of life in its sheer discharge that is to be experienced on the other side of that horror. And if you can keep that in that, particularly that second paragraph I really like, but if you keep that in mind of all the depictions of Silenus in art, and again, this isn't one that Meis uses, but this one most encapsulated that quote. This is The Drunken Silenus by Honoré Daumier from 1848. And I'm assuming it's pastels or charcoal, both, but it just seems to capture the frenzy. You get the sense they're spinning round. And then just to start to wind this up, but with reference, appropriately enough, with the concept of mortality. But I'm going to mention briefly, there's a short story by Jorge Luis Borges called The Immortal. So he's an Argentinian short story writer I've referred to previously, and I really, if you want short reads, he'll have you thinking for ages, but He writes in short, snappy short stories often, sometimes only a paragraph at a time. But I'd argue both Borges, so that they're opposite ends of the spectrum. You've got Borges doing short stories mostly and some poetry, and then you have Proust à la recherche de Pompidou, one of the longest novels ever written. But both of them would be pretty meaningless, but without the concept of mortality, which is one of their key themes. Because both are also about memories, and with, as I'll explain, without mortality, memory becomes a largely meaningless concept. And Proust's à la recherche de Pompidou, it's so poignant because it's a narrator looking back over his own life. And it's the length, but the impending future where that life will end, and all these things together that give the resonance and the meaning to the memories. But again, this is me. So what is being human without being finite, without losing time, without the memory of past experience and the movement towards the cessation of all experience? Well, losing time, the translations of La Recherche de Pompidou, it's early translations called it remembrance of things past. So that's resonant without the memory of past experience there. And then later, in search of lost time, so without losing time. Both those notions are represented in the way à la recherche de Pompidou has been translated. It is nothing. We can't understand it. The idea of an infinite being is the idea of a being that cannot ever be understood. The experience is too far away. It can't even be called experience. And just to give you another visual example, this time Silenus is depicted more as a satyr, so it's slightly complicated. He's always associated with the satyrs. But it's sometimes ambiguous as to whether he is one himself, but in this depiction he is. But the point, the link with Midas here is despite all that gold, bling, he's oblivious to it, and yet again he's just drinking to forget. Or drinking to absent himself from the scene. So just to summarise this short story as quickly as I can, the idea is that there's a Roman soldier and he hears a rumour that there's a river that gives him, if you drink from it, you gain immortal life. So he takes his men on an expedition, and most of them leave him, and in the end he's on his own because it's too hard and they think it's a fool's errand. And then he finally drinks, I don't think he knows at the time that's what it is, but he drinks from a river and he then obtains immortality. And he reaches the ruins of an ancient city that he guesses must have looked stunning. But all the people they've destroyed it and then are living in the labyrinthine passages and channels underneath, like a rabbit warren. And then there's men, scruffy, trampy men, who are living in these like almost graves in complete state of dishevelment. And one of them, when he gets talking to him, he realizes from the conversation that this is Homer, the great epic poet. And Homer can't remember that he is Homer. He can't remember that he wrote these amazing epics because he's lived so long. All memories just merge into one. It's this never-ending existence. And in that sense, it's incredibly poignant, but also shows the practical non-workability of immortality. So this is from the short story. Death, or reference to death, makes men precious and pathetic. Their ghostliness, as opposed to goatliness, is touching. Any act they perform may be their last. There is no face that is not on the verge of blurring and fading away, like the faces in a dream. Everything in the world of mortals has the value of the irrevocable and contingent. And another example of what looks like potentially fun, but in the face, this absolute weariness. So in contrast to the mortals, among the immortals, on the other hand, every act, every thought is the echo of others that preceded it in the past with no visible beginning, and the faithful presage of others that will repeat it in the future. Advertiginem. 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 Advertiginem, I think the Latin is I will notice. If anyone in the comments is a Latin scholar, please let me know. There is nothing that is not as though lost between indefatigable mirrors, which reminds me of the whole Insta culture. The Kardashian photographing the Kardashian being photographed by somebody else. Nothing can occur but once. Nothing is preciously in peril of being lost. The elegiac, the sombre, the ceremonial are not modes the immortals hold in reverence. I think that's ultimately what the Rousseau evokes in me, the elegiac, the sombre, the ceremonial, also De Chirico. They are not the modes the immortals hold in reverence. So it's this paradox, we're only sensitive to the elegiac and sombre qualities in painters like Rousseau and De Chirico because of our mortality. And then Homer and I went our separate ways at the portals of Tangier. I do not think we said goodbye. And I don't know why also, there's a lot of me not knowing today, but I do not think we said goodbye. Borges has this tendency to have little throwaway lines that are actually quite poignant or evocative. And I do not think we said goodbye, because what would be the point of saying goodbye to someone who's immortal? Goodbyes only have meaning within mortality. So in that tiny little phrase, it's quite a profound idea. And then this is, again, they're all called Drunken Silenus from 1626. Giuseppe de Ribera. I included this just because this is a slightly darker portrayal of the Satyrs. So the guy in the corner who's gone full on Spock with the very long ears. Again, this is what often happens in these paintings. In the very top corner, there are two faces together, but one guy is looking at us. And that's just a detail from the painting. You can see the little horns on the head. And I find this quite disturbing. So it's not the bleat of a goat that Meis is talking about, but it's the braying of a donkey, and then the slightly demonic younger satyr. The way, again, you're being looked back at, involved in the painting. Every culture that has lost myth has lost by the same token its natural healthy creativity. Only a horizon ringed about with myths can unify a culture. The forces of imagination and the Apollonian dream are saved only by myth from indiscriminate rambling. That's what I do. The images of myth must be the demonic guardians, ubiquitous but unnoticed, presiding over the growth of the child's mind and interpreting to the mature man his life and struggles. Well, if Nietzsche's right on this, I'd suggest this explains part of Gen Z's problem. The tragedy of Gen Z's anxiety is that it lacks this structuring quality of myth and, by extension, literature and visual art, and the mythical components that I've been showing you that reside within the art. So the forces of imagination and the Apollonian dream are saved only by myth from indiscriminate rambling. The indiscriminate rambling of constant clicking for views. social media, the constant interpenetration of all these self-referential links. And what you're losing, according to Nietzsche at least, is the growth of the child's mind being structured in various ways and helping the mature man to interpret his own life and struggles. So this is all part of my argument. This is what Gen Z lacks. And then another, for some reason, this is one of my favourites of all the depictions. And I think it's because of the face. The absolute cheesed off look on that face. And then you've got the Maenad on the right with the mask wearing it on top of her head. So in this case, literally being two-faced. But I just think this summarises beautifully the whole trapped in the netherworld quality to Silenus. And almost as the way his body, the heft of his body is resisting, he's being held up by the Satyrs. There's this inertial resistance to not wanting to continue with all this, but he's trapped within it. And just in case it gives any better detail, this is the black and white version. And towards the end of Mises' book, he mentions it's a semi-mythical, it's just a theory that I think it's the Hittite and the Mycenaean Empire in the 1200, 1300 BC. There are vague references into any existing literature, which, as you can imagine, is very scarce. But there's a sense that there might have been these like roving bands of pirates who helped to accelerate the decline of some of the very early civilizations in the Mediterranean. And they were just referred to as the Sea Peoples. So Meis uses them as a jumping off point. And he says, the Sea Peoples may simply be the name that a few terrified scribes gave to elements of their own civilizations that had broken off in the chaos of decline and turned against themselves. Maybe, sometimes, civilization wants to go under. It generates its own destructive forces to accomplish that. Forces from within that come forth to carry it all under. The record goes black. A moment of total silence when even Silenus can rest. And I just thought that was quite touching in the sense that if you look at that face again, the idea that Silenus can finally find their rest, or his rest. Just wanted to show you where my thoughts are going on that one. But also, perhaps more significantly, just to finish off the last slide to introduce it, this idea that maybe sometimes civilization wants to go under. It generates its own destructive forces to accomplish that. Forces from within that come forth to carry it all under. And this is what I've used in the previous couple of videos on Jeff Bezos. This is the Italo Calvino type of the madness that lies in the constant photographing of photography itself. This is, in civilizational terms, the enemy within the gates. At a future day, there's a C.P. Cavafy poem called Waiting for the Barbarians, which also implies the barbarians never turn up, and the implication is the barbarians are already within the city. And I just think in civilizational terms, that's what this represents. The Sea Peoples, not SEA, but the Sea People as in the celebrities with a capital C. They are what will bring our civilization down if it hasn't already fallen. So I'll just finish with, on that, life-affirming note, a quote from Nietzsche, which I think sums up this image. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, and till next time, all the very best.